he's fantastic. But I actually spoke to Mike Pompeo about that. He likes the idea of having somebody in there with him, and I do too. We have 15 candidates. Everybody wants it badly, as you can imagine, and we'll probably next week sometime make that decision. It's a great job. It's great because it's a lot of fun to work with Donald Trump, and it's very easy, actually, to work with him. You know why it's easy? Because I make all the decisions.
Alrighty, the president now needs to find a fourth national security advisor. The third person to hold that job, John Bolton, who the president once called Mike Bolton, as Trump prepares to meet world leaders at the UN General Assembly next week. The U.S. is facing several foreign policy challenges. For example, Taliban leaders were due to arrive as house guests at Camp David before the president nixed that idea. The president continues to send conflicting messages on tariffs with China, now says he's open to an interim trade deal of some sort. He also seems open to another meeting with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, even as the Treasury Department imposes new sanctions to punish North Korean computer hackers. So, to sort it all out, with us tonight, Christopher Dickey, a veteran foreign correspondent, journalist, author. He is the Paris-based world news editor for the Daily Beast, who happens to be with us here in New York tonight. And just in case people don't recognize you, I have something prepared for people as we normally see you. There is the Champs-Élysées, Christopher Dickey.
Oh, well.
Tonight, we're getting the New York Christopher Dickey. What a treat to have you here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I have to start on the darkest note. Tell the good people watching at home what you said to me about democracy in the break.
Oh, I think in the United States, I think in Great Britain and across Europe to some extent, we're seeing the death of democracy. We're seeing the rise of what is calling itself populism, claims to speak in the name of the people, but in fact is destroying the basic institutions of Republican, small r, Republican government.
When the history books are written, A, that is one of the more chilling things said at this table. B, when the history books are written, how much credit or blame will Mr. Putin get?
Well, either he's very lucky or very skilled in manipulating the situation, or both. I think both. I think he's benefited from characters like Boris Johnson. I don't think Boris Johnson's necessarily working for Putin. I think he's definitely benefited from the election of Donald Trump. He's benefited from the crisis of migration and other issues that have created a sense of really great misgivings in Europe. And he's basically taking revenge, because you have to remember about Putin that he feels and has always felt that the Western intelligence services were undermining his authority and interfering with his efforts to rebuild the Russian Empire. And so this is his revenge. He saw the weakness in the Western systems, and he went after them. And the first and biggest target, well, not the first, but the biggest target was the United States. He used on us techniques that he'd use in the Baltic republics and other places, and they were very successful.
The UK right now is a mess. If it's not a mess, it'll do till the mess gets here. Will we look back on Brexit as the first probing of the Russians to see if they could not affect a democracy and the Atlantic Alliance?
Yeah, I think they didn't have to do that much work on Brexit. They did try to influence the Brexit situation, but I don't think that they had really prepared for it that much, because nobody really had seen it coming. I mean, when David Cameron called for this referendum, although he said he would do it, it was one of those things that people think, nah, he's not really going to do it. Oh, sure, he's going to do it. Then he does it, and he was sure that everybody would vote, let's stay in Europe, or at least most people would. But no. The result comes out, and it's based on all kinds of things, the resentment of rural populations, fears of migration, this kind of thing. And the Russians tried to feed that. But where they really went to work was on the United States. That we see very clearly from the Mueller report. There's this whole idea now that somehow the Mueller report was some fabrication, that it was irrelevant. It's very clear. It's very detailed. It's very unequivocal. The Russians set out to have a profound effect on the elections in 2016. I don't think they thought that Trump would win, but they thought they could undermine the authority and the credibility, the legitimacy of Hillary Clinton by the kinds of games that they played. And then when they saw that Trump could win, of course, they put as much effort as they could into supporting it.
Before we send you back to the Champs-Élysées at the conclusion of your brief trip home, if I begged you to end on a hopeful note, maybe in a post-Merkel Germany, maybe in Europe, where would it be? Where do you find hope?
Well, I think there are frustrations in every one of the countries. I think that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, where I live, I think that he is trying to do the right things. I think he is a Democrat, although his authority is very powerful. But I think that he understands the kinds of things that we're discussing. Merkel also, although she's on her way out, she's a lame duck, she's still a powerful influence for democracy.
Yeah.
We saw in Spain, people have been hanging on to democratic institutions, a country that still remembers fascism for what it really was. And I think there are signs of resistance, many signs of resistance. A lot of people thought that the European parliamentary elections a few months ago would be swept by these far-right parties, and that didn't happen. In fact, the parties that are on the rise are the Green parties in Europe, because in Europe, unlike in the United States, the environment, climate change, those are huge and vital issues for voters at many levels, but particularly for the young people of Europe, and they just basically don't want to inherit a world that's where they'll be burned alive.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.